Hi everyone. In today's class, we're going to continue our discussion on evidence of evolution. In the previous video, we looked at fossil record and comparative anatomy and physiology as two pieces of evidence for evolution. In today's video, we're going to look at the last three. So the third piece of evidence for evolution is called embryological evidence. So this, of course, involves embryos. So similar organisms go through similar stages of embryonic development. Okay, meaning that if you take a fish or a human, okay, and you look at them like as adults, yeah, major differences. We know that they're not from the same species. However, if you look at their embryos, they look very similar to each other. So all vertebrates, okay, meaning animals with a backbone, they tend to develop things like gill pouches. Okay. We commonly find these gill pouches in fish and amphibians, but when animals like birds, reptiles, mammals, we only see gill pouches in their embryonic stage. As adults, once they're born, those gill pouches close up. Okay, so as adults, we don't, see gill pouches at all, but when we look at them as embryos, they are actually present. So to give you an idea of what this kind of looks like, here you have about 7 different organisms. Okay, as adults, they look very different. So if you look at the fish, salamander, and tortoise, okay, all the way down to like the mammals over here, like cows, rabbits, and humans, they look very, very different. But when you look at them early on in their embryonic stage, they all look very similar. Okay, the gill pouches would be kind of close to the head. It's hard to, I don't even think they're even drawn into the diagrams here, but every embryo at this stage do actually have gill pouches. Okay, so that kind of tells us that these animals must share a common ancestor at some point, and therefore is a good piece of evidence for evolution. The fourth piece of evidence is called biochemical evidence. Here, of course, we're looking at different organisms' biologies. So organisms that are biochemically similar have fewer differences in their DNA amino acid sequences. Okay, so that is just another way of saying that we share similar genetics. Okay, if two species have genes and proteins that match, those sequences must have been copied from a common ancestor. Okay, so again, it's similar to the embryological evidence, but here, when we're analyzing the biochemistry, in order for us to have the same biochemistry, we must have shared a same common ancestor. So the example I'm going to give you is an example that you guys have heard of before. Okay, you guys are aware that humans and chimpanzees are very close relatives to each other. Okay, we have about a 99.9% similarity in our blood protein groups. So this means that even though chimpanzees are our closest living relatives, right, we must have a very close or direct common ancestor. Okay, so the common ancestor is not far removed in our evolutionary history. To give you an idea, let's take a look at the next diagram. Okay, so here's a diagram outlining the evolutionary journey, okay, between our two species. So notice that the top line here, it has the number of years, like millions of years in the past. So roughly about 9 million years ago, there is a common ancestor between chimpanzees and humans. Okay, so that common ancestor gave rise to our two groups. So you have to understand that the common ancestors that they're referring here is basically just a large population of similar individuals. So if we take a small population of that group, a small population may accumulate enough changes to develop into humans. Okay, the same type of organisms, the same species, but a different population might undergo different changes that led them to become chimpanzees. Okay, so the idea is chimpanzees did not turn into humans. Okay, and this is also a good way of illustrating why there are great apes. Okay, because most people understand that humans evolved from the great apes, but why are there humans and great apes today? Well, that's because not every single great great ape evolved into humans. Only a small population did. Okay, and as that population became more successful, we now have more humans than great apes. Okay. The last piece of evidence is called biogeographical evidence. Now, this one here fits in nicely with the whole common ancestor for the chimpanzees and humans. If you do have one population, okay, of the same species, but they were separated, okay, due to some kind of change in geography and environment, then each group may accumulate enough changes over millions of years and become two distinct, different species. So something like this probably has happened to the humans and chimpanzees, where there could have been some kind of natural isolation or some kind of geographical or environmental barrier that separated the populations. But regardless of what the means is, as long as two populations are now separated, they will evolve differently. So if we take a look at the Canadian goose, which is an animal that we all know and love, there is a version of this Canadian goose in Australia. Okay, and it kind of looks like this. Now, at first glance, when you look at it, you might think, oh, that goose looks like a Canadian goose. But clearly, it's different. Now, these two species, in terms of their current existence, they have not accumulated enough change, okay, to become two distinct species. Okay, if you take a Canadian goose in North America and mate it with the one in Australia, they can still produce fertile offspring, which suggests that they still belong to the same species. But if we give it a few more millions of years, this Canadian goose in Australia, they may accumulate enough change so that they wouldn't be able to mate with the North American version anymore, thus becoming a new species. So if we take a look at some examples where there has been enough change, okay, to distinctly separate these island inhabitants from their continental versions, which is usually the case, okay, then you'll get animals like the marine iguana, the giant tortoise, or even the wombat. So most of these organisms, they represent evidence for biogeographical evidence of evolution. So most exotic life on the Hawaiian Islands, okay, if you've ever been to Hawaii, okay, there's lots of plants and insects that look familiar, but very, very different from what we would normally see in North America or in Europe or Asia. Okay, the Galapagos Islands, which are just found off the coast of Ecuador and Peru, okay, they also are host to a large variety of different yet familiar organisms and plants. So in order to develop these animals, most of the time we found that as long as you have a remote island or an isolated biogeographical area, you will find these organisms evolving. Okay, one in particular are the mammals. Okay, you can find mammals all across the globe, but there are two large groups of mammals: placental mammals and marsupials. And how they developed was basically through biogeography. So if you look at the wombat here, you find them in New Zealand. They do have a counterpart in North America. Okay, most kind of cuddly types of mammals kind of resemble that, but in North America, we do actually have one and only one marsupial, and that's called the possum. Okay, marsupials, for some reason, developed way better in Australia, okay, rather than in the continent of North America. Okay, but what connects these two animals together is that because they're marsupials, they will actually have their young develop outside the body, okay, either in a sac or a pouch, kind of like kangaroos. Okay, whereas most placental mammals, like dogs, cats, humans, cows, okay, our young basically develop inside the body. So to give you a visual on that, okay, here we have a young kangaroo. This shot was taken inside the pouch, okay, but because it's inside a pouch, the pouch itself is outside the mother's body, okay, that's why we say that it's a marsupial, okay, and not a placental mammal. In order to be a placental mammal, obviously you have to have a placenta, which is this structure on the left-hand side here of the photograph, okay, attached to the umbilical cord, which is attached to the fetus. So all of this is inside the body, okay, well protected. Now, at some point, before there were actually mammals that were marsupials and mammals that were placental, these two must have shared a same common ancestor. Okay, we actually know what that common ancestor is. That common ancestor is called a monotreme. Okay, monotremes, we do have a modern version of the monotreme. Okay, but monotremes are basically mammals that still lay eggs. Okay, so they don't have an external pouch, they don't have a placenta, they lay eggs. Now, the split between populations of monotremes that resulted in marsupials and placental mammals, we estimate that to have happened about 65 million years ago. Okay, 65 million years ago was also roughly around the same time the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs struck Earth. So during that time, mammals actually, like the number of mammals and the types of mammals that were on the planet exploded. Okay, because all the dinosaurs died, these mammals now took over. So that's why at 65 million years ago, they were probably some monotremes, okay, mammals that still laid eggs, but because the conditions in their environments became very different, marsupials started to develop, placental mammals started to develop, okay, and then there's population of monotremes that still remained as monotremes. Okay, those monotremes eventually became modern monotremes today. I think it's the only representative of modern monotremes, but a platypus is basically a modern monotreme. So when you look at a platypus, it kind of looks like a beaver because it has a similar shaped kind of tail. It's covered with fur, it has claws, etc. It has limbs, except that this platypus here has a mouthpiece that's shaped like the bill of a duck. So that's why this particular platypus is called a duck-billed platypus. So every single monotreme still lays eggs, and that's really the only difference between this type of mammal versus the other two. Okay. Now, we've talked about all 5 different types of evidence for evolution. No matter which category we're looking at, okay, all of them should at least do one of 3 things. They should support the idea that species can change over long periods of time. Because remember, creationists often believe that animals do not change, okay, or species cannot change. But evolution requires that species change or be able to change through long periods of time. A good piece of evidence should also incorporate or support the idea that different species come from a common ancestor. Okay, a lot of our evidence kind of points to there being a common ancestor between different types of species. And thirdly, all evidence for evolution can or should support the idea that the environment and genes are active factors of evolution, meaning that evolution is shaped by the types of genes that we have, that we pass along from one generation to another, and its connection to the environment. So the animal's ability to survive, okay, whatever environment that they're living in. So this concludes our section on evidence for evolution. In the future, we'll look at different types of mechanisms of evolution, as well as different types of adaptations that can lead to different types of evolution. Right, that's all the time I have for today. See you guys soon. Thank you.